After my husband died, my daughter-in-law kicked me out of the house. At the inheritance meeting, she threw a cup of coffee at me and said, "Having fun living with the street dogs?" When the lawyer read my net worth, she was frozen to the bones. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I never thought I'd be 66 years old and homeless. But there I was, standing on the front porch of what had been my home for 38 years, clutching a single suitcase while my daughter-in-law Susan threw my belongings onto the lawn like I was some kind of vagrant. "You can't do this, Susan," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. My hands were shaking, though I couldn't tell if it was from the cold November air or the shock of what was happening. "This is my home too." Susan turned to face me, her perfectly manicured hands on her hips. She was wearing one of those expensive yoga outfits that cost more than my monthly grocery budget, her blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail that probably took her stylist an hour to make look effortlessly messy. "Was your home, Bessie," she said, emphasizing each word like she was talking to a child. "Harold is gone now, and I'm not running a charity for old women who can't take care of themselves." The neighbors had started to gather. Mrs. Peterson from next door was pretending to water her already dead flowers while craning her neck to get a better view. The Johnsons across the street weren't even trying to be subtle. They were standing right on their front steps, whispering to each other. "I took care of Harold for 42 years, I said, my voice getting stronger despite the tears threatening to spill over. "I raised your husband. I helped raise your children. This house has my life in it." Susan laughed, a cold sound that made my stomach turn. "Your life? Bessie, let's be honest here. You've been dead weight for years. Harold supported you, and now that he's gone, I'm not about to pick up where he left off." That's when my grandson Tommy came around the corner, dragging my old rocking chair behind him. The same chair where I'd rocked Harold Jr. to sleep when he was a baby, where I'd sat during countless nights when he had nightmares, where I'd waited up for him during his teenage years. "Where should I put this, Mom?" Tommy asked Susan, not even looking at me. "Garage sale pile," Susan said without hesitation. "Most of this junk isn't worth keeping anyway." I felt something break inside my chest. Not my heart. That had been cracking slowly since Harold's funeral 3 weeks ago. This was something deeper, something that had been holding me together all these years. "That chair belonged to my mother," I said, stepping toward Tommy. "Please, it's all I have left of her." Susan stepped between us, her face twisted with annoyance. "Everything in this house belongs to me now, Bessie. Harold left it all to his son, and his son left it all to me. You don't get to pick and choose what you want to take." "I helped pay for this house," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "I worked 2 jobs while Harold went to night school. I cleaned other people's houses so we could make the mortgage payments. And Harold appreciated that, I'm sure," Susan said with mock sympathy. "But that was decades ago. What have you contributed lately? When's the last time you paid a bill around here? When's the last time you did anything besides take up space and eat our food?" The truth was, I hadn't contributed financially in years. Harold had insisted I stop working when he got his promotion at the insurance company. "A man should support his wife," he'd said, so I'd become a housewife, taking care of the home, raising our son, being the perfect supportive spouse. But I had contributed in other ways. I'd cooked every meal, cleaned every room, done every load of laundry. I'd nursed Harold through his diabetes, his high blood pressure, his heart problems. I'd driven him to every doctor's appointment, filled every prescription, made sure he took his medications. None of that seemed to matter now. "Where am I supposed to go?" I asked, hating how small my voice sounded. Susan shrugged. "There's a nice senior community about 20 minutes from here. Very affordable. Or maybe one of those extended stay motels until you figure something out. I'm sure someone with your experience can find some kind of work." She said experience like it was a dirty word. My granddaughter Lisa came out of the house carrying a box of my photographs. For a moment, I thought she might be bringing them to me, but instead she set the box down next to the garbage cans. "Lisa, honey," I said, reaching toward her. "Those are pictures of your father when he was little. Pictures of you and Tommy as babies." Lisa looked at her mother, then back at me. "Mom says we need to focus on the future, not live in the past. It was like being slapped. Lisa had spent countless hours with me, looking through those photo albums, listening to stories about her father's childhood, learning about our family history. Now she was throwing it all away like it meant nothing. "You have until sunset to get your things," Susan said, checking her Apple Watch. "After that, anything left behind gets donated or thrown away." I looked around at the scattered remnants of my life. Clothes that had been thrown into trash bags, books I'd read 100 times, the ceramic figurines I'd collected over the years, everything that made up who I was, spread across the lawn like debris after a tornado. "Please," I said one more time, "let me stay until I can find a place. I won't be any trouble. I'll stay in the guest room, I'll help with housework, No." Susan's voice was final. "I've already talked to a realtor about putting this place on the market. A house this size is too much for me and the kids to maintain. We're going to downsize, maybe get something with a pool." She was going to sell the house. The house where Harold and I had brought our newborn son home from the hospital. The house where we'd celebrated birthdays and anniversaries and holidays. The house where Harold had died in his sleep just 3 weeks ago, with me holding his hand. The moving truck pulled up to the curb, and Susan's face lit up with relief. "Perfect timing," she said to the movers. "Everything on the lawn needs to go to storage unit number 47. I'll give you the address." I realized then that this had been planned. Susan hadn't just decided this morning to kick me out. She'd been preparing for it. She'd rented a storage unit, called the movers, probably already had the realtor lined up. She'd been waiting for Harold to die so she could get rid of me. As the movers started loading my belongings into their truck, I stood there feeling like a ghost watching my own life being erased. The neighbors were still staring, some of them shaking their heads in disapproval, but none of them stepping forward to help. Mrs. Peterson finally came over, her face full of pity. "Bessie, honey, if there's anything I can do." "She'll be fine," Susan interrupted before I could answer. "Bessie's tougher than she looks. Aren't you, Bessie?" I didn't trust myself to speak. If I opened my mouth, I was afraid I'd either scream or collapse entirely. When the truck was loaded and pulling away, Susan handed me a business card. "That's the storage facility. You've got 30 days to figure out what you want to do with your stuff before they start charging monthly fees." 30 days. 66 years of life reduced to 30 days in a storage unit. As Susan turned to go back into the house, my house, the house that was no longer mine, she paused and looked back at me. "Oh, and Bessie, don't come around here bothering the kids. They need stability right now, not reminders of sad old times." The door closed behind her with a finality that echoed in my chest. I stood there on the sidewalk, holding my suitcase, watching the lights come on in the windows of the house where I'd lived most of my adult life. For the first time since Harold's funeral, I started to cry. Not the dignified tears I'd shed at the cemetery, but ugly, desperate sobs that shook my whole body. I had nowhere to go, no one to call, and less than $300 in my checking account. But as I stood there in the growing darkness, something Susan had said kept echoing in my mind. "What have you contributed lately?" If only she knew the truth about what I'd really contributed all these years. If only she knew about the secret I'd kept hidden even from Harold himself. She was about to find out that underestimating Bessie Morrison was the biggest mistake of her life. The Sunset Motel wasn't the kind of place I'd ever imagined staying. The carpet was stained, the walls were thin, and the smell of cigarettes and disinfectant hung in the air like a permanent cloud. But it was all I could afford on my Social Security check, and the manager had been kind enough to give me a weekly rate when I explained my situation. 3 weeks had passed since Susan kicked me out, and I was learning what it meant to be invisible. At the grocery store, cashiers looked right through me as they scanned my generic brands and discount items. At the laundromat, younger people pushed past me like I wasn't there. Even at the senior center where I'd started eating lunch twice a week because it was free, I sat alone while the other women chatted about their grandchildren and their bridge games. I'd tried calling Lisa and Tommy several times, but their phones went straight to voicemail. When I finally got through to Lisa, she'd been cold and distant. "Mom says we shouldn't get involved in adult problems," she'd said, her voice sounding rehearsed. "She says you'll figure things out and be stronger for it. Adult problems, like being homeless at 66, was some kind of character-building exercise." I'd driven by the house twice hoping to catch the kids when Susan wasn't around, but the second time, Susan had come storming out of the front door, her face twisted with fury. "I told you not to come around here," she'd screamed, loud enough for the whole neighborhood to hear. "The children don't want to see you, Bessie. You're just confusing them with your drama." Drama. That's what she called being thrown out of my own home. Now I spent my days in the motel room, watching game shows and trying to make my small savings last as long as possible. I'd applied for a few part-time jobs, retail, cleaning services, anything that would hire a woman my age. But so far, nothing had come through. The worst part wasn't the cramped room or the questionable stains on the bedspread. It wasn't even the way the other motel residents looked at me with pity, clearly wondering what I'd done wrong to end up there. The worst part was seeing Susan's social media posts. I'd never been on Facebook before, but one of the other women at the senior center had shown me how to look up Susan's profile on her phone. Every few days, Susan posted pictures of the house, new furniture she'd bought, renovations she was planning, family dinners with the kids looking happy and well-fed. In the captions, she talked about fresh starts and focusing on the future and teaching the children about independence and self-reliance. She made it sound like kicking me out had been some kind of valuable life lesson for Tommy and Lisa. The comments from her friends were the worst part. "So proud of you for taking charge of your life. The kids look so much happier already. It's amazing how much lighter the house feels without negative energy." Negative energy. That's what 38 years of keeping a family together had become. I'd started keeping a notebook, writing down memories of Harold and our life together, afraid that if I didn't record them somewhere, they'd disappear entirely. The way Susan talked, it was like those years had never happened, like I'd never existed at all. But I had existed. I'd been the one who stayed up all night when Harold Jr. had pneumonia when he was 7. I'd been the one who drove him to baseball practice every Tuesday and Thursday for 6 years. I'd been the one who helped him with his homework, who listened to him practice his saxophone, who held him when his first girlfriend broke his heart. Where was Harold Jr. now? Susan claimed he was busy with work, traveling for his job in sales, but I hadn't heard from him since the funeral, my own son, and he'd vanished from my life as completely as if he'd never been born. On Thursday afternoon, I was sitting in the motel parking lot, trying to work up the courage to go inside and face another evening alone, when a familiar car pulled up beside me. It was Mrs. Henderson, Harold's sister. I hadn't seen her since the funeral, and for a moment, hope fluttered in my chest. Maybe she'd come to help. Maybe someone in the family still cared. "Bessie," she said as she got out of her car, "I heard about what happened." "Oh, Margaret," I said, standing up too quickly and feeling dizzy from the sudden movement. "I'm so glad to see you." But Margaret's expression wasn't warm. If anything, she looked uncomfortable, like she was here out of obligation rather than love. "I wanted to talk to you about Harold's things," she said, not returning my smile. "Susan mentioned that you took some items that belonged to the family." My heart sank. "I only took what was mine, Margaret. My clothes, my personal items. I left everything else." "Susan says you took Harold's watch, the one that belonged to our father." I felt heat rise to my cheeks. "Harold gave me that watch for our 20th anniversary. He said he wanted me to have something to remember his father by." Margaret shook her head. "That watch should stay in the family, Bessie. It should go to Harold Jr. Or maybe to Tommy when he's older." "I am family," I said, but the words sounded weak even to my own ears. "We're family," Margaret corrected gently. "Harold's gone now, and Susan is the children's mother. She's the one making decisions for the family." I stared at her. This woman who had been my sister-in-law for over 40 years, who had shared holidays and birthday parties and family vacations with me. In her eyes, I saw the same dismissal I'd been getting from everyone else. I was no longer part of the family. I was just a leftover from Harold's first life. "Fine," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'll give her the watch." Margaret looked relieved. "I think that's best. Susan also mentioned some jewelry that might have belonged to Harold's mother. Maybe we could go through your things together and make sure everything gets to the right place." The right place. Not with me, apparently. We spent the next hour in my cramped motel room, going through the few possessions I'd managed to salvage. Margaret took Harold's watch, his mother's pearl earrings, and even a small ceramic vase that had been a wedding gift from Harold's aunt. "You understand, don't you, Bessie?" Margaret said as she packed the items into a box. "These things have sentimental value to the family." I nodded, though I wanted to scream that they had sentimental value to me too. That I was the one who had polished that watch every week for 26 years. That I was the one who had worn those earrings to every important family event. That I was the one who had carefully packed and unpacked that vase through 3 different moves. After Margaret left, I sat on the motel bed and looked around at what remained of my life. A few changes of clothes, some toiletries, a handful of photographs that Susan hadn't bothered to throw away. That was it. That was all I had left to show for 66 years of living. I picked up one of the photographs, Harold and me on our wedding day, both of us so young and full of hope. I remembered that day like it was yesterday, the way Harold had whispered, "I love you," as we danced to our first song. The way his mother had cried happy tears as she welcomed me into the family. The way his father had shaken my hand and told me I was perfect for his son. Now Harold was gone, his mother was gone, his father was gone, and I was just a stranger living in a motel, no longer welcome in the family I'd helped build. That night, I called the storage facility to check on my things. The woman on the phone was businesslike and cold. "Your 30 days are almost up, Mrs. Morrison. If you don't make arrangements for payment, we'll have to dispose of your items. Dispose of them. Like they were garbage. How much would it cost to keep the unit for another month?" I asked. $150 plus late fees. I had $87 left in my checking account. "I'll call you back," I said, and hung up before she could respond. I lay on the uncomfortable motel bed, staring at the water stain on the ceiling, and wondered how my life had come to this. 3 months ago, I had been Harold Morrison's wife, living in a beautiful house, surrounded by family, respected in my community. Now I was nobody, with nothing, and nowhere to go. But as I drifted off to sleep that night, my hand instinctively went to the small locket around my neck, the one piece of jewelry I'd managed to keep hidden from Margaret's inventory. Inside was a photograph of my mother, and wrapped around the photo was something else, something Susan and Margaret and even Harold himself had never known about, a safety deposit box key. Tomorrow, I would visit that box for the first time in 20 years. And Susan Morrison was about to learn that she had made the biggest mistake of her life. The First National Bank looked the same as it had 20 years ago, with its marble floors and high ceilings that made every footstep echo. I sat in the waiting area, clutching my purse so tightly my knuckles had turned white, while a young banker verified my identity and retrieved the safety deposit box I hadn't touched since 1983. My hands trembled as I inserted the key. And for a moment I wondered if I'd imagined it all. Maybe the box would be empty. Maybe the scared young woman who had opened this account 40 years ago had been fooling herself about what she was building. But when the metal door swung open, everything was exactly as I'd left it. Stacks of papers, carefully organized and wrapped in plastic bags to protect them from time. Stock certificates, property deeds, bank statements from accounts Harold had never known existed. And beneath it all, a thick leather journal where I'd recorded every transaction, every investment, every careful step I'd taken to build something that belonged to me alone. I picked up the journal with shaking hands and opened to the first page, written in my younger self's careful handwriting. January 15th, 1963. Harold thinks I'm taking sewing lessons on Tuesday evenings. Instead, I'm working as a bookkeeper for Mrs. Patterson's dress shop. $15 a week. It's not much, but it's mine. Reading those words brought it all back. The fear, the secrecy, the careful planning that had defined my life for decades. Harold wasn't a bad man, but he was a man of his time. He believed deeply that wives shouldn't work, that a husband's job was to provide, and a wife's job was to keep house. When I'd mentioned wanting to take a part-time job early in our marriage, he'd been genuinely hurt. "Are you saying I can't take care of my own family?" he'd asked, and the wounded look in his eyes had made me drop the subject immediately. But I'd never forgotten the fear I'd felt during his brief period of unemployment in 1962. For 3 months, we'd survived on savings and my father's small loans, and I'd lain awake at night terrified that we'd lose everything. That's when I decided I needed something of my own, something that could protect us if Harold's job ever disappeared again. So I'd started small. The bookkeeping job at Mrs. Patterson's shop, telling Harold I was learning to sew. Then a weekend job doing inventory at the hardware store, claiming I was visiting my sister. Every dollar I earned went into a separate account at a different bank, one Harold knew nothing about. I turned the pages of my journal, following the careful progression of my secret financial life. In 1965, I'd used my savings to buy a small duplex in a rundown part of town. Nothing fancy, but the rent from both units more than covered the mortgage payment. Harold never questioned where the extra money for groceries and household expenses came from. He was happy to have a wife who was such a good manager. By 1970, I owned 3 rental properties. By 1975, I'd diversified into stocks, spending my sewing circle evenings at the library, teaching myself about investments from financial magazines and annual reports. Harold would come home to find me reading Better Homes and Gardens, never knowing I'd spent the afternoon analyzing dividend yields and price-to-earnings ratios. "You're so lucky, Bessie," he'd often say. "You don't have to worry about all this financial stress. You can just focus on making our home beautiful." If only he'd known that while he was worrying about his small salary and modest pension, I was quietly building a portfolio that would have shocked him. The banker cleared his throat softly. "Mrs. Morrison, is everything all right?" I realized I'd been sitting there for 20 minutes, lost in memories. "Yes, I'm fine. Could I have some time alone with the box, please?" When he left, I pulled out my most recent bank statements, the ones I'd been too afraid to look at since Harold's death. I'd been so focused on playing the grieving widow, on being the person everyone expected me to be, that I'd ignored the financial empire I'd spent 40 years building. The numbers on the pages made me dizzy. My stock portfolio, carefully managed by a broker who knew me only as B. Morrison, was worth $2. $3 million. The real estate holdings, now 8 properties in various stages of appreciation, were valued at another $3. $1 million. And the business investments, the small companies I'd quietly backed over the years, had grown into something I barely recognized. According to the most recent statement, my total net worth was $7 million. I stared at the number until it started to blur. $8.7 million. More money than Harold had earned in his entire career. More money than Susan would see in her lifetime if she spent every penny of Harold's modest life insurance policy and pension, and she'd thrown me out like I was worthless. I thought about the past 3 weeks, the nights I'd lain awake in that terrible motel room, wondering how I'd buy groceries, the humiliation of eating free lunches at the senior center, the way Margaret had looked at me with pity as she took away the few possessions I had left, all while I was worth nearly $9 million. Why had I kept it secret for so long? In the beginning, it had been about protecting Harold's pride. He'd been raised to believe that a man who couldn't support his family was a failure, and I'd loved him too much to make him feel inadequate. Later, it had become a habit, a part of my identity that felt too private to share. And if I was honest with myself, there had always been a small part of me that enjoyed the secret. In a world where I was expected to be helpless and dependent, I'd built something powerful and independent. It had been my quiet rebellion, my proof to myself that I was more than just Harold Morrison's wife. But the secrecy had cost me everything. Because I'd never told Harold about my wealth, he'd never thought to leave me anything beyond the house in his will. And because his son had inherited everything, Susan now controlled what she thought was the family's entire financial legacy. She had no idea that the real family fortune belonged to the woman she'd thrown out like garbage. I pulled out my phone and called my broker, a woman named Patricia whom I'd been working with for 15 years, but had never met in person. "Mrs. Morrison?" Patricia's voice was warm and professional. "I was so sorry to hear about your husband's passing. I sent flowers to the funeral home, but I wasn't sure if you received them." "Thank you, Patricia. They were beautiful." I paused, gathering my courage. "I need to make some changes to my accounts." "Of course. What can I help you with today?" I took a deep breath. "I want to liquidate some of my holdings. I'm going to need access to cash fairly quickly." "How much are we talking about?" I looked around the small bank vault, thinking about Susan's smug face as she'd thrown my belongings onto the lawn, thinking about the way she'd laughed when I'd said the house had my life in it. thinking about her social media posts about fresh starts and negative energy. $2 million to start, I said. I have some purchases to make. There was a brief pause. That's quite a bit of liquidity, Mrs. Morrison. May I ask what you're planning? I want to make sure we structure this in the most tax-efficient way possible. I smiled for the first time in weeks. I'm buying a house, Patricia. A very specific house. After I hung up, I sat in the vault for another hour, going through every document, every statement, every piece of evidence of the life I'd built in secret. Some of the investments had performed better than I'd ever dreamed. A small tech company I'd backed in the early 90s was now worth more than my original house. A piece of commercial real estate I'd bought on a whim had tripled in value when the city built a shopping center nearby. I'd been brilliant, and I'd been careful, and I'd been patient. Everything Susan thought she knew about me was wrong. When I finally left the bank, I felt different. Not just because of the money, though that was part of it. For the first time since Harold's death, I felt like myself again. Not the helpless widow everyone pitied, not the burden Susan had discarded, but Bessie Morrison, the woman who had quietly built an empire while everyone around her assumed she was just a housewife. I drove to the public library and spent the rest of the afternoon researching property records and real estate listings. By the time I left, I had a plan. Susan thought she'd won when she kicked me out of the house. She thought she'd gotten rid of the deadweight, cleared the path to her inheritance, secured her children's future. She had no idea that the deadweight she'd discarded was about to buy the ground right out from under her feet. The next morning, I called Susan's realtor. According to the listing I'd found online, she was asking $485,000 for the house I'd helped pay for, the house where I'd raised my son, the house where I'd spent 40 years of my life. I'd like to make an offer, I told the realtor. Cash, no contingencies. I can close in 2 weeks. The realtor sounded excited. That's wonderful. What price did you have in mind? I thought about Susan's face when she'd called me dead weight. I thought about her telling the neighbors that I couldn't take care of myself. I thought about her social media posts celebrating my absence. $550,000, I said. $65,000 over asking. Cash. It was time for Susan to learn that she'd underestimated the wrong woman. Susan must have gotten the call from her realtor around noon on Friday. I know this because at 12:47 p.m. my phone started ringing with a number I'd blocked weeks ago. When I didn't answer, the calls kept coming. 7 times in 10 minutes before she finally gave up and started texting. Who is trying to buy my house? Bessie, I know this is you somehow. Call me right now or I'm calling the police. I set my phone aside and continued packing. After 3 weeks in the Sunset Motel, I was moving into a furnished apartment downtown. Nothing fancy, but clean and respectable while I waited for the house purchase to go through. I'd already signed the lease and paid 6 months in advance, enjoying the way the property manager's attitude had changed when I'd handed him cash instead of filling out credit applications. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a voicemail from Harold Jr., the first time I'd heard from my own son since the funeral. Mom, Susan says someone's trying to buy the house with a cash offer way over asking price. She thinks you're somehow involved, which is crazy because, well, you know. But she's really upset, and the kids are confused. Can you just call her back and tell her it's not you? She's driving everyone nuts. I almost laughed. Even my own son couldn't imagine that I might have access to that kind of money. To him, I was still just the helpless widow who'd been living off his father's generosity. Instead of calling back, I drove to the real estate office and met with Susan's agent, a cheerful woman named Janet who had no idea she was caught in the middle of a family war. Mrs. Morrison? Janet looked confused as she checked her paperwork. I'm sorry, but you have the same last name as the seller. Are you related? I'm Harold Morrison's widow, I said simply. The house belonged to my late husband. Janet's expression shifted to one of confusion and concern. Oh my. I think there might be some misunderstanding here. Mrs. Susan Morrison is the one selling the property. She inherited it from her late husband. That would be my son, I explained. He inherited it from my husband, his father. But Susan is free to sell it, of course. I'm simply interested in purchasing it as an investment property. The lie came easily. I'd had 40 years of practice at keeping the truth hidden. Janet looked through her files, clearly uncomfortable. Well, your offer is certainly attractive. Mrs. Morrison, Susan Morrison, was hoping to get the asking price, but $50,000 over is quite generous. May I ask why you're interested in this particular property? I gave her my most innocent smile. It holds sentimental value. By Monday morning, Janet called to tell me that Susan had accepted my offer. She'd also apparently demanded to know who the buyer was. And when Janet told her it was Harold Morrison's widow, there had been, in Janet's diplomatic words, quite a reaction. She seemed very surprised, Janet said carefully. She asked me to verify your financial information several times. I assured her that your cash offer was legitimate and that we could close whenever you're ready. I could only imagine Susan's reaction. She'd probably spent the weekend trying to figure out how I could possibly have access to that kind of money. In her mind, I was surviving on Social Security and living in a motel. The idea that I could buy a $500,000 house with cash probably seemed impossible. She'd always been curious about money, even when Harold was alive. I remembered the way she'd study our bills when she visited, making little comments about how expensive everything was getting, how lucky Harold was to have a stable pension. She'd once asked Harold directly how much he'd saved for retirement, and he'd been embarrassed by the question. "Susan, that's not really any of your business," he'd said gently. "I just worry about you both," she'd replied. "I want to make sure you're prepared for the future." Now I wondered if she'd been calculating that future even then, adding up what she thought Harold was worth and planning what she'd do with it when he was gone. On Tuesday, I decided to have a little fun. I drove to the house during the day, when Susan would be at her part-time job at the boutique downtown. Tommy was in school, but Lisa was home sick. I could see her through the living room window, curled up on the couch watching TV. I knocked on the door, and Lisa answered in her pajamas, looking surprised and a little guilty to see me. "Grandma Bessie?" She glanced over her shoulder nervously. "Mom's not here." "I know, honey. I just wanted to see how you were feeling. Your grandmother Margaret mentioned you had a cold." Lisa nodded, but didn't invite me in. "I'm okay. Just staying home from school today. Are you eating enough? Taking your vitamins?" I reached into my purse and pulled out a $20 bill. "Here, have your mom order you some soup for lunch. Chicken noodle is best when you're sick." Lisa stared at the money like it was a foreign object. "Grandma, where did you get this?" The question broke my heart. In her mind, I was so poor that $20 was suspicious. "I've been managing my money carefully," I said. "Now take this and get yourself something healthy to eat." She took the money reluctantly, still looking confused. "Grandma, are you okay? Mom said you were living in a motel and couldn't afford to keep Grandpa's things. Your mother was mistaken about a lot of things," I said gently. "I'm doing just fine, sweetheart. Better than fine, actually." I could see the wheels turning in Lisa's head. "Are you getting help from someone? Mom says the government sometimes helps old people who can't take care of themselves. Old people who can't take care of themselves. That's how Susan had described me to my own granddaughter. Lisa, honey, I want you to know that I've always been able to take care of myself. I've been taking care of other people, too, for a very long time. Sometimes adults don't understand everything that's happening around them, even when they think they do." She nodded slowly, though I could tell she didn't really understand. "Will you tell your mother I stopped by to check on you? Should I tell her about the money?" I smiled. "You can tell her whatever you want, sweetheart." That evening, Susan called me directly. This time I answered. "What the hell are you trying to pull, Bessie?" No greeting, no pleasantries. "I'm not trying to pull anything, Susan. I heard you were selling the house and I'm interested in buying it." "With what money?" Her voice was sharp with suspicion. "You're living in a motel. You couldn't even afford to keep Harold's things in storage." "I found a way to get financing," I said calmly. "Sometimes things work out better than expected." "What kind of financing? Who would give you a loan for that much money?" I could hear the panic creeping into her voice. In her mind, she'd calculated every angle, controlled every variable. The idea that I might have resources she didn't know about was clearly terrifying to her. "It's a private loan," I said, "from someone who believes in me." "Bullshit. I want to know who's giving you this money and why." "Susan, I don't owe you any explanations about my financial arrangements. You wanted to sell the house and I want to buy it. It's a simple business transaction." There's nothing simple about this, and you know it. Her voice was getting higher, more frantic. You're trying to manipulate me somehow. You're trying to make me look bad. I'm trying to buy a house that I'd like to own. Nothing more, nothing less. There was a long pause. When Susan spoke again, her voice was different, colder, more calculating. If you somehow manage to scrape together the money for this house, what makes you think I'll let you have it? I could withdraw my acceptance. I could refuse to sell to you. You could, I agreed, but you've already signed the purchase agreement, and Janet tells me you've already spent quite a bit of money preparing for the move. Deposits on a new place, moving expenses. It would be expensive to back out now. Another pause. You've been planning this, haven't you? This whole helpless widow act was just a performance. I've never pretended to be helpless, Susan. You just assumed I was. Where is this money coming from, Bessie? I know you didn't have it when Harold died. Did you take out a reverse mortgage on some property? Did you sell something valuable that belonged to the family? She was getting desperate now, grasping for any explanation that would make sense in her limited understanding of who I was. The money is mine, Susan. It's always been mine. That's impossible. Harold supported you your entire marriage. You never worked. You never contributed financially. There's no way you could have this kind of money unless you took it from somewhere else. I felt a familiar anger rising in my chest, the same feeling I'd had when she threw my belongings onto the lawn. You don't know anything about my contributions to this family, Susan. You don't know anything about me at all. I know enough. I know you're up to something, and I'm going to figure out what it is. The line went dead. I set my phone down and looked around my new apartment, thinking about Susan's words. She was right about one thing. I had been planning this in a way. Not consciously, not with revenge in mind, but for 40 years I'd been building something that could protect me when I needed it most. I'd just never imagined I'd need protection from my own family. The next morning, I got a call from Janet. Mrs. Morrison, I have some unusual news. The seller is requesting additional documentation about your financing. She wants proof of funds, bank statements, verification letters from your lender. That's quite unusual for a cash transaction, isn't it? Very unusual. Normally, proof of funds is sufficient. She seems concerned about. Well, she mentioned something about family disputes and wanting to make sure everything is legitimate. I smiled. Tell Susan she can have all the documentation she wants. Schedule a meeting for Friday morning. I'll bring everything she needs to see. Are you sure? You're not required to provide this level of detail. I'm sure. It's time for some things to be cleared up. Friday morning couldn't come fast enough. Susan thought she was going to expose me as a fraud, prove that I was somehow scamming my way into buying the house. Instead, she was about to learn that the woman she'd dismissed as worthless dead weight was worth more money than she'd ever dreamed of. And this was just the beginning. The law office of Henderson and Associates was located in one of those old downtown buildings with high ceilings and dark wood paneling that was supposed to make you feel like important business was being conducted. I arrived 15 minutes early, wearing the navy blue dress I'd worn to Harold's funeral, the only formal outfit I'd managed to salvage from Susan's purge of my belongings. Susan was already there when I walked into the conference room, sitting at the far end of a long mahogany table with a stack of papers in front of her. She'd brought reinforcements. Harold Jr. sat to her right, looking uncomfortable in a wrinkled dress shirt, and Margaret sat to her left, wearing the same disapproving expression she'd had when she'd taken Harold's watch from my motel room. "Bessie," Margaret said with a tight smile, "I'm surprised to see you here. Are you?" I set my purse down and took a seat across from them. Susan requested this meeting to discuss financial documentation. I assumed the whole family would want to be involved. Susan's lawyer, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, cleared his throat. Mrs. Morrison, the elder Mrs. Morrison. I should clarify that this meeting is somewhat irregular. My client has concerns about the source of funds for your house purchase, and she's requested verification of your financial capacity. "Of course," I said pleasantly. "I brought everything you asked for." I reached into my purse and pulled out a folder thick with bank statements, investment reports, and property records. As I spread them across the table, I watched Susan's eyes widen slightly. "These are statements from my primary checking and savings accounts," I said, pointing to the first set of papers. "As you can see, I have sufficient liquid assets to cover the house purchase without financing." Harold Jr. leaned forward, squinting at the numbers. "Mom, these numbers, they can't be right." Susan snatched the papers from his hands, her face growing pale as she scanned the figures. "These are fake. They have to be fake." "I assure you they're not," I said calmly. "Mr. Henderson, I assume you'll want to verify these with the financial institutions directly?" The lawyer nodded, making notes on his legal pad. "That's standard procedure for transactions of this size." "This size?" Susan's voice was getting shrill. "What size? How much money are we talking about here?" I pulled out another set of documents. "These are my investment portfolio statements. Stocks, bonds, mutual funds. All managed by Patricia Williams at Meridian Financial. You're welcome to call her directly." Margaret picked up one of the statements, her hands trembling slightly. "Bessie, this says you have over $2 million in stocks alone. $2.3 million, as of last week," I corrected. "The market's been good to me." Harold Jr. was staring at me like he'd never seen me before. "Mom, where did this money come from? Dad never mentioned anything about investments." "Your father didn't know about them," I said simply. The room fell silent. Susan was frantically flipping through papers, her face cycling through expressions of shock, confusion, and growing rage. "That's impossible," she said finally. "Harold supported you your entire marriage. You never worked. You never had access to this kind of money." I reached into my purse again and pulled out my leather journal, the one I'd kept hidden in the safety deposit box for 40 years. "Actually, I worked quite a bit. I just didn't tell Harold about it." I opened the journal to the first page and began reading aloud. January 15th, 1963. "Harold thinks I'm taking sewing lessons on Tuesday evenings. Instead, I'm working as a bookkeeper for Mrs. Patterson's dress shop. $15 a week." Susan grabbed the journal from my hands. "This is ridiculous. You're making this up." "Keep reading," I said. March 1965. Used savings to purchase duplex on Elm Street. Rent from both units covers mortgage with $300 left over monthly. Margaret was shaking her head slowly. "Bessie, if this is true, why didn't you ever tell us? Why keep it secret for so long?" "Because Harold wouldn't have understood," I said. "He was a good man, but he was a man of his time. He needed to feel like he was providing for his family. If he'd known I was working, if he'd known I was building wealth on my own, it would have hurt his pride." Harold Jr. was looking through more of the papers. "Mom, some of these properties, I recognize these addresses. That duplex on Elm Street, you still own that?" "I own 8 rental properties now," I said, "plus commercial real estate, and I've been a silent partner in several small businesses over the years." Susan slammed her hand on the table so hard that everyone jumped. "This is bullshit. You're telling me that while Harold was working himself to death at that insurance company, worrying about college funds and retirement savings, you were sitting on millions of dollars?" "I was building financial security for our family," I said firmly. "Harold never had to worry about money because I made sure we'd always have enough." "By lying to him, by deceiving your own husband." I felt my temper flare. "By protecting him, by making sure that if anything happened to his job, if he got sick, if the insurance company failed, we wouldn't lose everything. Which, by the way, proved to be a good decision when he had his first heart attack and couldn't work for 6 months. Harold Jr. looked confused. "But Dad's disability insurance covered that period. Your father's disability insurance covered 60% of his salary," I said. "The rest came from my rental income. How do you think we managed to keep the house, keep you in college, maintain the same standard of living?" The truth was settling over them like a heavy blanket. For 40 years, they'd thought Harold was the financial foundation of our family. They'd never questioned where the extra money came from when times were tight, never wondered how we always seemed to have enough for emergencies and unexpected expenses. Susan was still going through my papers, her hands shaking with rage. "Even if this is all true, even if you somehow managed to hide millions of dollars from your own husband, it doesn't change anything. Harold left everything to his son, and Harold Jr. left everything to me. That's the legal inheritance." "You're absolutely right," I said. "Harold's assets went to Harold Jr., and Harold Jr.'s assets came to you, but my assets belong to me." Margaret spoke up, her voice uncertain. "Bessie, Surely some of this money came from Harold's income over the years. Community property laws would apply if Harold had known about the money and contributed to it, the lawyer interjected. But if Mrs. Morrison built this wealth independently, using income her husband was unaware of, it would likely be considered separate property. Susan's face was bright red now. This is insane. You can't have been married to someone for 42 years and kept millions of dollars secret from them. I can and I did, I said calmly. Every Tuesday evening when I told Harold I was at Sewing Circle, I was actually at my bookkeeping clients or checking on my properties. Every Saturday when I said I was shopping with girlfriends, I was meeting with contractors or potential tenants. Every time I told him I'd gotten a good deal on groceries, it was because my rental income was covering our household expenses. Harold Jr. was looking at me like he'd never seen me before. Mom, why didn't you tell me? Even after Dad died, why didn't you say anything? The question hung in the air, and for a moment I felt the weight of all those years of secrecy. Why hadn't I told them? Why had I let Susan throw me out of my own home when I had the power to stop her? Because I wanted to see who you really were, I said finally. I wanted to see how you'd treat me when you thought I had nothing to offer. The silence that followed was deafening. Susan was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. You let me throw you out. You let me humiliate you in front of the whole neighborhood. You watched me struggle with the house payments and the kids' expenses, and you said nothing. I watched you celebrate getting rid of me, I corrected. I watched you post on social media about your fresh start and your relief at clearing out the negative energy. I watched you tell my grandchildren that I was too old and useless to be part of their lives. Harold Jr. buried his face in his hands. Oh God, Mom, what have we done? Susan stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. No, I'm not going to let you turn this around and make us the villains. You deceived everyone. You lied to your own family for decades. I protected my family for decades, I said, standing to face her. But that family is gone now. Harold is dead, and you made it very clear that I'm not welcome in the new version. I reached into my purse one more time and pulled out a thick envelope. Mr. Henderson, these are the documents for the house purchase. As you can see, I'm paying cash, $65,000 over asking price. I'd like to close as soon as possible. Susan's face went white. You can't do this. I can do whatever I want with my money, Susan, just like you did with Harold's. I gathered up my financial documents and put them back in my folder. I think we're done here. Mr. Henderson, please let me know when the closing is scheduled. As I walked toward the door, Susan's voice followed me, high and desperate. This isn't over, Bessie. I'll fight this. I'll find a way to prove that money isn't really yours. I paused at the door and turned back to look at her. Susan, I have 40 years of documentation proving every dollar I earned and every investment I made. I have witnesses, business partners, and financial institutions that can verify my story. What do you have? She opened her mouth, but no words came out. That's what I thought, I said. Enjoy the rest of your fresh start. As I walked out of that conference room, I could hear Susan crying behind me. Not tears of sadness, but tears of rage and disbelief. She'd built her entire future on the assumption that she was inheriting everything of value from Harold's family. She'd never imagined that the worthless old woman she'd thrown away was worth more than everything else combined. But the best part was still to come. Because buying the house was just the beginning of what I had planned for Susan Morrison. 3 weeks after the meeting at the lawyer's office, I stood in the driveway of 412 Maple Street, my house now, watching a moving truck pull away. Susan had fought the sale until the very last moment, hiring her own lawyer to challenge the transaction, demanding investigations into my finances, even trying to claim that I'd somehow coerced Harold Jr. into selling me the house at below market value. None of it had worked. Every document I'd provided was legitimate, every bank statement verified, every property deed authentic. After 40 years of careful record-keeping, my financial empire was unassailable. The house looked different now that it belonged to me again, not because anything had physically changed, but because I was seeing it through different eyes. This wasn't the family home where I'd lived at Harold's sufferance. This was my property, purchased with my money, owned entirely by me. I walked through the rooms slowly, taking in the changes Susan had made during her brief tenure as owner. New paint in the living room, different curtains in the kitchen, updated fixtures in the bathrooms. She'd spent quite a bit of money making the place hers, money she'd borrowed against Harold's life insurance payout, money she now owed to credit card companies and couldn't repay. My phone buzzed with a text from Patricia, my financial advisor. House closing confirmed, funds transferred. Also wanted you to know, the Morrison woman's real estate agent called asking about your other properties. I told her we don't discuss client information. I smiled. Susan was still trying to figure out the extent of my wealth, probably hoping to find some weakness she could exploit. She'd never understand that I'd spent 4 decades making myself unexploitable. Another text came in, this one from Harold Jr. Mom, can we talk? I've been trying to process everything that happened at the lawyer's office. I feel like I don't know who you are anymore. That one made my chest tighten. My relationship with my son would need careful rebuilding, if it could be rebuilt at all. He was struggling with the realization that everything he'd believed about his family was wrong, that his mild-mannered mother was actually a secret millionaire who'd been pulling strings behind the scenes for decades. But before I could focus on healing that relationship, I had one more piece of business to take care of. I drove to Sunset Gardens, the apartment complex where Susan had moved after being forced to sell the house. It was a decent place, not luxurious, but clean and safe, much nicer than the motel where she'd expected me to live indefinitely. Susan's apartment was on the 2nd floor. I climbed the stairs slowly, my knees reminding me that I was still a 66-year-old woman, regardless of my net worth. When I knocked on the door, there was a long pause before it opened. Susan looked terrible. Her hair was unwashed, her clothes wrinkled, and her eyes were red-rimmed from crying or lack of sleep or both. Behind her, I could see moving boxes stacked everywhere, as if she'd been living out of cardboard containers for weeks. "What do you want?" she asked, not inviting me in. "I wanted to see how you were settling in," she laughed bitterly. "Settling in? I'm drowning, Bessie. The credit cards I used to fix up the house are maxed out. The moving expenses wiped out what was left of Harold's life insurance. I can barely afford this place, and I certainly can't afford the rent increases they're talking about for next year." "I'm sorry to hear that. Are you? Are you really sorry, or are you here to gloat?" I looked past her into the apartment, where I could see Lisa and Tommy sitting on a couch that looked like it had come from a thrift store. They waved at me tentatively, and I waved back. "I'm here to make you an offer," I said. Susan's eyes narrowed. "What kind of offer?" "I own several rental properties. One of them is a nice 3-bedroom house about 10 minutes from the kids' school. The current tenants are moving out next month." "I can't afford to rent a house, Bessie. I can barely afford this apartment. The rent would be $400 a month." Susan stared at me. "400? That's impossible. A 3-bedroom house rents for at least $1,200 in this area. Not my house, not for you." She was quiet for a long moment, and I could see her mind working, trying to figure out the catch. "Why would you do that?" she asked finally. "Because despite everything that's happened between us, Lisa and Tommy are still my grandchildren. They shouldn't have to suffer because their mother made some poor decisions." "Poor decisions." Susan's voice started to rise. "Poor decisions. You're the one who lied to everyone for 40 years. You're the one who deceived your own husband. You're the one who let me humiliate myself by throwing you out when you could have stopped it at any time." "You're right," I said calmly. "I could have stopped it. I could have told you about my money the day you kicked me out of my home. I could have written you a check to cover Harold's funeral expenses instead of watching you stress about the cost. I could have helped with the kids' college funds or the house repairs or any of the 100 other financial problems you've mentioned over the years." Susan was crying now, ugly tears that streaked her makeup. "Then why didn't you?" "Because I wanted to see who you really were when you thought I had nothing to offer. I wanted to see if the woman my son married would show kindness to a helpless old widow, or if she would throw her away like garbage the moment she became inconvenient." The words hung between us like a judgment. "And now you know," Susan said quietly. "Now I know." I reached into my purse and pulled out a lease agreement I'd had my lawyer draw up. "The offer stands. $400 a month, including utilities, month-to-month lease, so if you find something better, you can leave any time. Susan took the papers with shaking hands. What's the catch? There has to be a catch. No catch. But there are conditions. Such as? You don't badmouth me to the children. You don't try to turn them against me or poison them with your resentment. Whatever problems you and I have, we keep them between us. Susan nodded slowly. And you get a job. A real job. Not part-time retail. Something that can support you and contribute to your children's futures. I'm offering you a way to get back on your feet, not a permanent free ride. She was quiet for a long time, reading through the lease agreement. Bessie, I don't understand why you're doing this. After everything I said to you, everything I put you through. I'm doing it for Lisa and Tommy, and maybe a little bit for Harold Jr., who's going to need his family to heal from all this. What about Harold Jr.? Have you talked to him? I shook my head. He's not ready yet. He's too angry and confused right now. But eventually he'll want to understand why I kept the money secret, why I let things play out the way they did. When he's ready to have that conversation, I'll be here. Susan wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. I was horrible to you. I said terrible things. I treated you like you were worthless. Yes, you did. And you're still willing to help me? I thought about that question as I looked at this broken woman in her cluttered apartment, surrounded by the debris of her collapsed assumptions. Was I helping her out of kindness? Out of guilt? Out of some desire to prove that I was better than her cruelty? Maybe it was all of those things. Or maybe it was something simpler. Susan, I spent 40 years hiding who I really was, because I was afraid of how people would react to the truth. I built walls around myself to protect my secrets, and those walls kept me isolated even from the people I loved most. I don't want to live like that anymore. I paused, choosing my words carefully. I'm not doing this to punish you or to prove how generous I am. I'm doing it because holding on to anger and resentment would just be another kind of prison. I've been in enough prisons. Susan signed the lease with tears still streaming down her face. As I prepared to leave, she caught my arm. Bessie, do you think there's any chance we could start over? Not go back to the way things were, but maybe build something different? I looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had caused me so much pain, who had revealed such ugly truths about herself when she thought she held all the power. I don't know, I said honestly, but I think we both owe it to those children in there to try. 6 months later, I was in my garden, the garden behind the house that was truly mine now, when Lisa and Tommy came running across the yard. Susan had kept her word about the job hunting and was now working as an administrative assistant at a medical practice. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was steady, and she seemed to be taking pride in her independence. Grandma Bessie, Lisa called out, Mom says you're taking us school shopping tomorrow. If that's what you'd like to do, I said, setting down my pruning shears. Tommy looked up at me with Harold's eyes. Grandma, is it true that you're really rich? I smiled. I'm comfortable, sweetheart. But like really rich. Mom says you could buy anything you wanted. Having money doesn't mean buying everything you want, I said. It means having the freedom to choose what's important to you. What's important to you? Lisa asked. I looked at these two beautiful children, products of a complicated family that was slowly learning how to heal itself. I thought about Harold Jr., who had called me last week for the first time since the lawyer's meeting, tentatively asking if we could have lunch together. I thought about Susan, who was working hard not just at her job, but at becoming a better version of herself. Family, I said, but not the kind of family that demands you give up who you are to belong. The kind of family that loves you for exactly who you are. As the children ran off to play, I sat back in my garden chair and looked at the house that had witnessed so much pain and deception, but was now becoming something new. The walls I'd built around my secrets had finally come down, not in the destructive way I'd always feared, but in a way that let light in. For the first time in 40 years, I was exactly who I appeared to be, Bessie Morrison, a woman of means, a woman of substance, a woman who had learned that the best revenge isn't cruelty or punishment. The best revenge is living well, on your own terms, with the people who truly deserve your love. And I was finally, completely living well. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.